Ch.32 in the Great Martial Hall, Crown Prince meets Crown Prince. Si Lian knew this ring must be something Hua Cheng left behind. He held it in his hand and wondered, for a moment, what could this be? When Si Lian was still a crown prince, he grew up in the palace of Xianlei. The kingdom of Xianlei had always reveled in beautiful, precious objects. Collectors were abundant, and the palace itself was therefore, of course, glorious and bedazzling. Golden columns, jaded steps, innumerous treasures and precious jewels. Even the noble children played around with various colored gems like toys. By the looks of this ring, it did seem like it was made of diamond. However, its shape was exquisite. Perhaps even the most skilled jeweler would not be able to craft the ethereal natural beauty it emanated. Moreover, of all the diamonds he had ever seen, this stone was extraordinarily clear, shimmering like a crystal, fascinating and sublime, making it hard for him to determine exactly what it might be made of. Still, even if he couldn't tell what the ring was made of, it was for sure an item of extreme significance. Besides, if it was found around his neck, then this was not something that was accidentally dropped. It was more than likely a gift from Hua Cheng as a keepsake. Si Lian was a little surprised, receiving a keepsake like this. He smiled softly, resolved to take good care of it, and to ask the boy what the gift meant the next time they met. The only place he owned was the broken-down shrine. There was nowhere appropriate for him to hide treasure, so after some thought, the best place was on his person after all. Si Lian put the silver chain around his neck once more. After returning from running around Mount Yujun and the Banyu Pass back to back, Si Lian laid in Puchi shrine paralyzed for a few days. If it wasn't for some of the overly passionate villagers who'd come and offer buns or porridge, he'd probably have stayed incapacitated for many more days. He spent his days thus, until one day, Ling Wen suddenly sent him a notice: return to the heavens at once. Judging by her tone, something bad was about to go down. Si Lian could more or less guess what it might be, and was already mentally prepared. Is this about the Banyu Pass? That's right, Ling Wen replied. When you've returned to the heavens, come directly to the Great Martial Hall. Upon hearing Great Martial Hall, Si Lian froze. Zhang Wu, 31, was back. After his third ascension, he still hadn't greeted Zhang Wu. As the #1 martial god, Zhang Wu spent his days deep in cultivation behind closed doors, or was out patrolling the realms, keeping the world secure. Now that Zhang Wu was back, Si Lian couldn't get out of making this trip to the heavens. And so, he hiked up to the heavenly capital once more. After only a few days of rest, all manner of gods and immortals had the divine palaces built here, each with their own history and style. Banding together, they formed the great city, sculpted pillars and mural buildings here, little bridges and streams there. The heavenly court had one main road, the martial deity avenue. Although there were many such roads built in remembrance of Zhang Wu in the mortal realm, they were only mere shadows and copies of the real one in the heavens. Si Lian walked on through the expansive road and headed towards the heavenly court. En route, there were many heavenly officials in a hurry, and not a single one dared greet him. Truthfully, there were usually not many who would greet him when he visited the heavenly court. However, not greet meant no fellow officials would approach him or initiate any conversation, but they would still nod in acknowledgement, as was proper. Right now, everyone was pretending he wasn't there, as if just glancing at him would get them in trouble. If they were in front of him, they would hurry away. If they were behind him, they would slow their pace, leaving him a wide berth, afraid to approach. Lian was already used to this treatment, and didn't think anything of it. After all, he did just drag down the popular and newly ascended General Fei Jr. It'd be more strange if no one stayed away. Yet, unexpectedly, as he walked, a voice suddenly called out from behind him. "Your Royal Highness." Hearing the call, Lian was amazed, thinking whoever it was that dared call him truly had commendable courage. But when he turned his head back, the junior official that called for the Royal Highness rushed by him, and ran towards someone who was walking further ahead of him. He called as he ran, "Geez, Your Royal Highness. How can you forget your identity pass going to the Great Martial Hall? How would you even get in?" Only then did Lian get it. No wonder. Of course the address, "Your Royal Highness," wasn't directed at him. There were a number of crown princes in the heavens, so some confusion wasn't anything extraordinary. Yet when he glanced over and saw the other crown prince, he paused. That young man had thick brows and bright eyes with a wide smile. This smile was vastly different than those of many other heavenly officials. It was one that was pure and genuine without anything behind it, and added an air of youth to his handsome face. However, to have another harsher official, like new king, provide comment, they would probably call it an air of foolishness. The young man was decked in armor, proud and heroic, but the armor on him didn't give off a sense of blood and battle. Rather, it gave him an air of royal nobility, candid and brilliant. Lian stopped in his step and stared at the young man. The two in front felt his gaze and turned back to face him. When the junior official saw who it was, his face dropped immediately. Lian lightly nodded his head and smiled at him. "Greetings, Your Royal Highness." The other crown prince obviously was one who didn't mind the everyday details and didn't recognize his face, so when he saw someone greeting him, he immediately returned it with a bright smile and shouted, "Greetings." The junior official beside him gave him a little push, and hurried. "Let's go, Your Highness. We still need to go to the Great Martial Hall." The young man, still unaware and inconscient, was weirded out by the sudden push. "Why are you pushing me?" Lian puffed out a laugh, and the junior official looked to be in even more of a hurry. He urged, "The Emperor is probably already waiting for us. Please let's go, Your Highness." The other crown prince could only give Lian a confused look before turning to leave. Lian stayed where he was as they walked away, and soon, whispers from officials of lower rank floated into his ears from afar. "Well, that was awkward. The world is such a small place, but they're both officials in the heavens. It was only a matter of time. If you ask me, General Nan Yang bumping into General Xuanzhen is more exciting an affair." Ha ha ha, what's the rush? They'll be bumping into each other real soon. They're all waiting at the great Marshall Hall, aren't they? Suddenly, someone commented, "Never mind a small world, really, it's people comparing each other that is it. People really are so different from one another. They're both crown princes, but His Highness Tai Tua is truly noble. If it was him, he wouldn't do anything shameful even when fallen from grace." The kingdom of Yongan was more prosperous than the kingdom of Xianlei after all, so of course the crown prince of Yongan would be stronger than that of Xianlei. How the grass grows depends on the land it grew on. Simple logic. The northern territory belonged to the palace of Ming Guang, the martial god Pei Ming. The western palace Qiying was Quan Yizheng. The southeast palace of Nanyang was Feng Xin. The southwest palace of Shenzhen was Mu King, and the one the eastern territory belonged to was the palace of Tai Hua, the martial god Lang Qianqiu. Lang Qianqiu, when he was immortal, was a crown prince like Si Lian. However, he was the crown prince of Yongan. The kingdom of Yongan was the country that was built after the fall of Xianlei, and the founder of Yongan was the rebel general who successfully overthrew the royal capital of Xianlei. When Si Lian drifted in the mortal realm, he had also visited the east, and naturally knew that the crown prince of Yongan had ascended. As heavenly officials, it would be inevitable for them to bump into each other, so he didn't think much of it. Maybe to anyone else, the gossiping whispers, albeit not really whispers, would probably never be heard, for fear of retribution. But those words were uttered without fear of Si Lian hearing, maybe even hoping for something exciting to happen should he overheard. So, Si Lian pretended to have heard nothing, and casually walked away. Just then, another voice came from behind, called out, "Your Highness." "Not again!" Exclamation mark. Si Lian thought, but this time when he turned around, it was someone who was addressing him for real. Ling Wen, with her dark circled eyes and arms full of scrolls, approached him. "Everyone has gone to the Great Martial Hall for the meeting. Be more mindful once you've reached the hall." Si Lian understood. "What do you think General Pei Jr.'s sentence will be?" "Exile, probably," Ling Wen replied. "That's actually not too bad. Not too severe," Si Lian thought. Exile was considered a temporary banishment for officials who had committed crimes, meaning the term of punishment was negotiable, and there might still be opportunities for resuming duties. If one day they should be found to be on their best behavior, they might yet get fished back up, maybe in 32, 50 years, maybe in 100 or 200 years. But to Si Lian, this not too bad was, of course, judging by his standards. To General Pei, it would be a completely different story. Si Lian remembered another thing, and said, "Oh yeah. Ling Wen, how goes the search for the boy with the human face disease from Mount Yujun I told you about last time? Do you have any news?" "I'm really sorry, Your Highness. I don't have anything at the moment." "We're working on it," Ling Wen replied. Even for a heavenly official, to find a person in such a vast world was not an easy task. Although the heavens might be faster, it was still only a difference of 10 years in the mortal realm versus 1 year in the heavens. Si Lian could only express gratitude. Thank you for your hard work. Just then, they reached the end of the avenue, and a majestic palace came to view before him. The palace had stood through the ages, yet it only showed enduring excellence, and none of its antiquity. Layers of glazed golden shingles pyramided, blinding in their scintillation. Si Lian raised his head and glanced at the great martial hall. Beneath the golden roof, the words, written with power and with vigor, were exactly the same as a few hundred years ago, unchanging. He lowered his head and stepped into the hall. Within, numerous heavenly officials had already gathered, either in their own groups of 2 or 3, or by their own lonesome, standing in silence. The only ones who may enter the hall were the heavenly officials who had officially ascended, all imperial. Sons of heavens are indomitable overlords, each bursting with spiritual might. They eyed each other in silent pride and judgment, their splendor overwhelming. At this time and place, everyone held their breaths, not daring to make a sound. On the throne at the very end of the hall sat a martial god decked in a pure white armor. This martial god was refined and dignified, his eyes closed and his lips unspeaking, poised and solemn. Behind him was the magnificent great martial hall, but beneath his feet was a pure white snowy peak. As if sensing Si Lian entering the hall, he opened his eyes. That pair of eyes were obsidian black, but bright and clear, as if formed by the melted snow of a lake, frozen for millions of years. When he blinked open his eyes, that martial god smiled softly. Qianlei, you've come. Si Lian lowered his head in a bow and said nothing. When Zhang Wu spoke, he was not loud, but his deep voice echoed through the entire great martial hall. Then all the eyes of the officials focused on Si Lian, and he understood immediately. It appeared this meeting wasn't for discussing General Pei Jr. and the Banyu Pass scandal. The spotlight, it seemed, was on him. The 31st of June, Zhang Wu translates to the Lord I Am. Next chapter. Ch.33, in the Great Martial Hall, Crown Prince meets Crown Prince 3. Ling Wen approached the throne, dressed all in black and without a word or smile. She drew a line through an item on her memo. My lord, there are a few heavenly officials still on patrol in the mortal realm, unable to return. Zhang Wu nodded. They have already reported in. Ling Wen acknowledged the response, and Zhang Wu turned to Si Lian. Qianlei, I'm sure you are curious as to why you have been summoned here today. Si Lian still had his head bowed. I can guess. However, I had assumed the matter with General Pei Jr. was already settled. Just then, a man's voice rang out. Whether if it's been settled is yet hard to say. The voice that came from behind was lyrical. When Si Lian turned his head to look, a martial god stepped into the great hall, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He walked towards the front. When he passed by Si Lian, he stopped in his step, and the corners of his lips lifted. Your Royal Highness, I've heard much about you. This martial god looked to be about 26 to 27 years old, graceful and confident in his actions. Looking at his face, Si Lian thought he looked even more handsome than that statue he saw at Mount Yujun. It was the kind of handsome that could definitely steal hearts. Very much the charming type. Si Lian didn't respond. He continued, our little Pei has been in your care. I've definitely offended him, Si Lian thought. he returned the greeting, "Please don't trouble yourself over it. I've heard much about you as well." The words, "I've heard much about you," was certainly not a lie. In the past few days, C. Lian had skimmed through his scroll and briefly read through the legends of some of the more famous heavenly officials. One of them was General Ming Guang Pei Ming. This martial god of the north was skilled in battle, but the most talked about thing amongst the mortals were stories of his many affairs, good and bad, within wanton alleys. The good stories had Pei Ming using copious amounts of gold to help save a pitiful prostitute from the brothels. She fell in love with him and forever remained pure and true to await his return. The bad stories had Pei Ming traveling thousands of miles to spend a one-night stand with a married woman, etc., and so on. On some level, Pei Ming was an awe-inspiring man. After reading through his stories, C. Lian thought it was quite unbelievable that, after so many years, only one Xuanji that came out of that way of life. Because Pei Ming was skilled in both battle and in love, many of his rivals and fellows loved cursing him to go die, and even better if he'd die from syphilis. But his life force was tough, and he never got infected with anything. Even after the many flowers he'd picked, he wouldn't die, and he'd even live longer than most of his fellows. Until, finally, one day he lost a battle. Everyone laughed, thinking, at last, it's his end. But then lightning crashed and thunder roared. In that moment of danger, he ascended to the heavens. Those who didn't die by his hand probably all died from outrage. After ascension, Pei Ming didn't change his way of life, and the scale of his tales of promiscuity greatly expanded. From fairies and lady officials to female ghosts and demons, as long as they were beautiful, he would pluck them. Nonetheless, his favorite type was still the charming ladies of the mortal realm. Many indecent love stories had him starring as the main male lead, and if it wasn't for C. Lian's method of cultivation that demanded purity of body and of mind, he probably would have read a couple of those books just out of curiosity. Thus, in addition to his role as the martial god that ruled the north, the mortal realm also worshipped him as the god of love. Even some officials would turn around and secretly pray to him should they bump into him in the heavens, hoping for some fortune in love. It had to be said that although similar, that title was definitely better than Feng Xin's unwarranted title Ju Yang. All the heavenly officials present in the hall knew in their hearts what "I've heard much about you" meant, and many roared with laughter in their minds. After the pleasantries, C. Lian said, "What does General Pei mean by not necessarily settled?" Pei Ming snapped his fingers, and a corpse floating in midair suddenly appeared in the middle of the great hall. Strictly speaking, this floating body was an empty shell. It had no soul, completely empty on the inside. But it was covered in blood from head to toe, so it was no different than a corpse. To have something like this appear before an elegant crowd like the heavenly officials was a shock. A moment later, Pei Su was also brought in, but he still looked indifferent and apathetic even with shackles binding his person, his head bowed low, unspeaking. "General Pei, what's the meaning of this?" C. Lian asked. Pei Su knelt down within the great martial hall, and Pei Ming replied, "A few days ago I went to visit Little Pei, and he mentioned something interesting." Pei Ming paced half a circle around Si Lian and smiled. "I'm quite familiar with Little Pei's ability. Even if his clone's powers are reduced and nowhere near the same as his true self, it's still quite competent. It's still capable of fighting evenly with a savage ghost. However, he told me there was a mortal that was able to beat him to the point where he had to relent. Now, isn't that interesting?" Pei Ming continued, and Sarai questioned him. "Apparently, at the time, there was a red-clothed young man next to your Royal Highness while you were at the Banyu Pass." Hearing the words "red-clothed" made all the officials present shift expressions. Then Pei Ming's following words made them all agitated. He said, "And this young man, in the dark, was able to eradicate all the menacing Banyu soldiers in a flash. Now, your Royal Highness, might you enlighten us who this red-clothed young man might be? If it wasn't a savage, then it must be a supreme, and one that could kill hundreds of savages in a flash, dressed all in red." Anyone could guess who that young man could possibly be, yet no one wanted to be the first to say the name. Si Lian stole a glimpse at the mute Pei Su, and replied a little unnaturally, Really? About that? I really don't remember it well. There was also a caravan that was trapped in the Banyu Pass at the time, and we spent a few days together, so maybe it was someone from the caravan." Pei Ming smiled. "That can't be right, your Royal Highness. According to Little Pei, you and that young man were abnormally close, not like someone you've just met for only a few days. How can you not remember?" "No, you're wrong. That was the truth. It really was only just a few days," Si Lian thought. Nevertheless, his expression gave nothing away. Just then, from the sidelines, a white-clad cultivator casually waved his whisk and spoke up. "General Pei, you've only heard Little Pei's side of the story. Little Pei has committed a crime. He's currently in detention, soon to be exiled. Whether his words are believable needs to be discerned. No. Then we shall see if General Nan Yang and General Xuan Zhen can give us a hand," Pei Ming replied. Following his line of sight, Si Lian found Feng Xin and New King standing separately on the southwest and southeast corners of the hall. Feng Xin still looked the same as in his memories, standing tall and straight, his eyes determined, and brows always slightly furrowed, as if there was always something annoying him, but really he wasn't annoyed at all. New King, on the other hand, was somewhat different than what he remembered. Although his face was still pale as chalk without much blood, his thin lips pursed, his eyes half-lidded, there was a cool air of "don't talk to me" surrounding him. He stood with his arms crossed, a finger on his right hand, tapping his left elbow softly, looking like he was either at ease, or more like he was scheming something. The two were definitely good-looking men, but each had their own flaws. Hearing Pei Ming calling them out, they both looked towards Jun Wu at the same time. It was only when Jun Wu gave a slight nod that they stepped forward reluctantly. This was the first time since Si Lian's third ascension that he'd come face to face with the two of them. He could sense all the eyes on him going wilder. Wild was inevitable. The great martial hall was the #1 martial palace of heaven. Those without the title of heavenly official had no entry rights to discuss matters. The first time the Crown Prince of Xianlei ascended, Feng Xin and Liu Qing were his deputy generals. At the time, they were only low-ranking officials from the middle court, without even the right to run errands within the Great Martial Hall. And now, not only could the junior officials of back then now stand in the hall, their rankings were even higher than that of their old master, truly a turn of fate. The three of them looked at each other, eyes flitting all over, stealing glimpses at each other but pretending not to care. Who knew what the other two were thinking? However, Si Lian could roughly guess why Pei Ming had called them out to help. As suspected, Pei Ming said General Nan Yang and General Xuan Zhen have both fought with Hua Cheng before. I'm sure they have the authority to speak regarding the weapon of that person. So, the point of bringing forth the empty shell at Zhao was for all to inspect its wounds. Feng Xin and Liu Qing slowly approached the floating body. Si Lian himself took a few steps forward to take a look, but there was so much blood darkened into black spots, it was hard to tell anything. The other two faces, austere, took their time in their inspection. Finally, they raised their heads and swept a look at each other, neither of them wanting to speak first. Lin Wen spoke up from next to the throne generals. Conclusion. It was Feng Xin who spoke first, his voice dark. It's him. The scimitar Yiming, Liu Qing added. Among all the heavenly officials present in the Great Martial Hall, it was probably only Si Lian who didn't know the significance of those words. The scimitar Yiming was the very same freakish weapon Hua Cheng had used when he singularly challenged the 33 officials and beat them to a pulp, decimating their souls and dignity. Within the Great Martial Hall, the heavenly officials started whispering to each other, the eyes watching. Si Lian unreadable. Pei Ming had attained his objective. Many thanks to the two generals for confirming this fact. If the red-clothed young man who traveled next to your Royal Highness really was that person, then this whole matter is going to be more complicated. The white-clad cultivator from before spoke up again. General Pei, are you saying His Royal Highness the Crown Prince of Xianlei colluded with a Supreme Ghost King specifically to frame General Pei Jr.? Both times when that cultivator spoke, he was on Si Lian's side, so he had to take a look at who exactly this curious fellow cultivator was. What he saw was a cultivator with clear, bright eyes. He had a whist between his arms, a long sword carried on his back, and a folding fan tucked in his white jaded belt. His form was graceful and elegant, his expression spirited. He looked familiar, but Si Lian couldn't recall when he had met anyone like this. Pei Ming also glanced at him, but it was the look of an irritated elder who didn't want to deal with children. He shook his head and waved dismissively, withdrawing the floating empty shell that was a Zhao, then turned around and continued his argument. It may not be collusion. Except that person is powerful and wicked, who knows if he might have used deceptive tricks to blind His Royal Highness. His intention was to make Hua Cheng out to be the real perpetrator behind the chaos of Banyu Pass. Si Lian rebuked General Pei, even if you don't believe me, you should still believe in the Wind Master. Back in the Sinner's Pit, General Pei Jr. admitted to the crime of luring passersby to the Banyu Pass with his clone, and the Wind Master heard everything. Pei Ming glanced at the white-clad cultivator again. Si Lian continued, besides, since we're both here at the Great Martial Hall, you can very well ask our Lord whether I have traces of any spells of deception on my person. Jun Wu, who sat high above, remained calm and unchanging, meaning Si Lian was cleared. Si Lian then continued, General Pei, let's keep things clear and separate. Let's not talk about whether the young man I traveled with was Hua Cheng or not. Even if he was confirmed to be Hua Cheng, it has nothing to do with what General Pei Jr. has done. A supreme ghost king might have the worst of names on people's lips, but not everything can be blamed on him either. His expression was composed and neutral when the name was uttered, but many in the hall had cold shivers run down their backs. Pei Ming replied, no matter what, I believe this affair needs to be re-examined. It'd be best if the Guoshi that your Royal Highness has taken away, Banyu, could be brought in for interrogation, too. To interrogate her for what? Force her to lie. Si Lian hadn't yet responded when someone else spoke up. First, Pei Su looked as if he didn't want to remain in the Great Martial Hall anymore. He said in a low voice, General, let it go. What? Pei Ming was irritated. There isn't any spell of deception. It's all my doing. I've disappointed you, Pei Su confessed. Pei Ming was in the middle of clearing his name, but then he went and said this. Pei Ming turned cold and said darkly, what enchantment concoction did that Banyu Guoshi feed you? Shut your mouth. However, Pei Su raised his head. Let it go, General. Little Pei isn't afraid to admit to things he's done. Since I've been caught red-handed, I'm not afraid to receive whatever punishment. Pei Ming's face was written full of the shock of you've always been so mature and competent, why did you suddenly go nuts today? He was just about to kick Pei Su over the head to wake him up when Jun Wu spoke up. Enough. The moment he spoke, Pei Ming withdrew his leg and bowed. Jun Wu spoke languidly, the matter of the Banyu Pass is settled. Take little Pei down and exile him in the next few days. After some silence, Pei Ming acknowledged, yes, my lord. Si Lian only just breathed in relief when Pei Ming continued, but Nan Yang and Xuan Zhen have proven that the wounds on that empty shell were indeed inflicted by the scimitar Yiming. I understand, Jun Wu replied. That is a whole other matter. Pray my lord will look into this matter, Pei Ming said. I will naturally investigate. Ming Guang and his fellow deities have no need for concern. After a pause, Jun Wu continued. You are all dismissed for today. Qianlei, you stay. It looked like Si Lian would be personally interrogated. The heavenly officials had nothing left to say and bowed their heads. Yes, my lord. Dismissed, the other heavenly officials exited in the groups of 2s or 3s. When Feng Xin passed by, he glanced at Si Lian, looking as if he had something to say, but stopped himself. Si Lian smiled at him, and he was startled before hurrying away. New King, however, walked past without sparing a look, as if Si Lian never existed. That white-clad cultivator walked over with his whisk in hand and a huge smile, ready to speak. But Pei Ming, who had just lost favor, walked over too, with one hand resting on his hilt and the other rubbing his nose. He said helplessly, Qingxuan, for your brother's sake, can you not stir up trouble? The smile disappeared from the face of that white-clad cultivator. General Pei, there's no need to use my brother against me, I'm not afraid of him. Yu Pei Ming was enraged but couldn't do anything. Finally, he pointed at him. You really done little Pei in now? 200 years of exile. The white-clad cultivator swung his whisk wildly. That's little Pei's own doing, this has nothing to do with me. Looking like he didn't want to continue to quarrel with Pei Ming, the white-clad cultivator stormed off. See, Lian thought Pei Ming might stick around to taunt him further, but he didn't and exited the hall willfully. In the large and spacious Great Martial Hall, the only one who remained besides Zhang Wu and Si Lian, who was below the throne, was actually the Crown Prince of Yong'an, Lang Qianqiu. Si Lian was curious. Why did he stay? When Si Lian approached, he had his eyes closed, fast asleep while standing. Si Lian didn't know whether to laugh or cry, and feeling quite awed, he gently tapped the young man's shoulder. Your Highness. Your Highness. Lang Qianqiu woke with a jerk. What's happened? Exclamation mark. Nothing's happened. The meeting is over, Si Lian explained. Having just woken up, Lang Qianqiu was still a little dazed, and asked in confusion, over. Just like that. What did we all discuss? I didn't hear anything. If you didn't hear anything, then never mind, Si Lian said. It wasn't anything important anyway. Come, now time to go back. Oh. Lang Qianqiu went to leave, but when he reached the doors, he looked back. Still confused, he, regardless, gave Si Lian a big smile. Thanks for waking me. Si Lian waved at him with a smile. When everyone had finally cleared out, Si Lian slowly turned around. Zhang Wu descended from the throne. Hands behind his back, he came before Si Lian. Crimson Rain Sword Flower. The scimitar Yiming. Si Lian was like a cat picked up by the scruff of his neck, and he involuntarily straightened up. So, what is going on? Zhang Wu questioned. Si Lian looked at him, then suddenly kneeled. Before Si Lian's knees touched the floor, Zhang Wu reached out and held his elbow, preventing him from kneeling. He sighed. Qianlei. Si Lian straightened once more, his head bowed. I'm sorry. Zhang Wu watched him. Then do you admit to your wrongs? I do, Si Lian replied. Then why don't you tell me what that wrong is? Zhang Wu said. MXTX author notes. In this text, to become a god, one must first become a hero, which is one who is special amongst mortals. Only a properly ascended mortal can become a heavenly official. How do their servants become proper officials? They have two options. First, they have to be adept at a particular skill, and enter either the martial or the civil rank. Second, they have to have the luck. If they have good luck, then there's a good chance. If they randomly find some spiritual potion on the side of the road, that works too. The officials in the middle court are those brought in by the upper court as deputy generals or servants. Basically, if you're on good terms with the big guns, they can pull you up. Although not a full-fledged official, you're still part of the heavens, so there's all sorts of people. So say a heavenly official had a close relationship with you, or if they thought you have a bright future, they'll promote you first. As long as you have the skill and chance, you can become a big gun yourself too.